You've been hired to help build a watermill in a remote countryside area. There's rumours of an ancient curse and a slithering antediluvial horror that stalks the nearby marshes. Come with me, you rogues and down and outs. We're trudging through if looks could kill. Hi everyone, I'm Gary back again, and today we're going to look at If Flux Could Kill, which is an adventure for WFRP for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, and it is part of I've got it as part of this collection, Adventures in Ubersreich. It's 21 pages, and its author is Dave Allen, and it's for inexperienced characters. Now, it was originally published as a standalone PDF. I remember I think it was pretty much the first adventure that came out for 4th edition WFRP, 4th edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. And now it has been compiled into Ubersreich Adventures. And there's a couple of these compilations, but this is the first one. And it's the first adventure in that book. It's illustrated by Ralph Horsley and Scott Purdy, and it is an absolutely brilliant adventure that really helps introduce people to the world of Warhammer. So before we get going, let's just talk about my bona fides. I've actually run it quite a few times. I've run it 3 times, every single time for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition. Every single time it was parties, low-level parties, inexperienced characters. It was always, in all 3 cases, it was the first adventure that characters had done, and of one of those times it was run as a one-shot. I don't think it works entirely well as a one-shot, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but it is a really, really good starter adventure. So what's the through line for this really good module? Well, Rutger Reuter, the son of a wealthy merchant family based in Ubersreich, has hired the player characters to build a mill on the Würfelfluss in the Grausee, which is a kind of area of permanent marshland in kind of like southern eastern Reichland. Now, the party begins on a barge with Rutger Reuter, who is a kind of foppish, kind of like young guy who he's a bit inexperienced at business, but he's basically friendly. And a group of Strigoni, which are travelers in the old world, and they're all on a barge, and they are heading to where they're going to build this mill. While they're heading there, so they have a little bit of a moment quickly to kind of like introduce each other, and then we get straight into the action because what happens is the barge is attacked by a stir pike, a giant pike, which is like great as an opening encounter, right? Not just generic kind of like fantasy fish, but like the idea of a giant pike with the underbite and the kind of like torpedo shaped body attacking. What it does is it hits the barge and one of the Strigoni kind of women, one of the older women on the barge gets knocked overboard, and it starts this combat. They fight the pike off, and they eventually make it to the building site, which is this mist enshrouded, eerie kind of riverbank deep in the Grausee. Or really, really close to the Grausee, I should say, deep in the kind of like countryside. They meet Rutger Reuter's business partner, Fräulein Stiegler, and she is much more experienced as a businesswoman. And it's really clear at the very beginning when they first arrive that that Rutger Reuter and Fräulein Stiegler do not get on at all. And it sets up a lot of kind of tension for the rest of the module. They also meet the other major NPC of the module, Thorgrim. He is a dwarf engineer, and he's in charge of building this mill, he's being employed by Stiegler and Reuter. But it's clear that anyone who is there who has any knowledge of engineering there, actually, he's doing a really terrible job. The tools are rubbish. The kind of like the framework, the lattice work of the scaffolding is all kind of like poorly put together. It's flooded, everything about it. There's just something not right, especially as a dwarf in this particular setting. You think he'd take more kind of pride in his work. And then what happens is it becomes an adventure in which is based in and around this construction site. And there's a couple of different things that go on. So the characters learn a lot of things through gossip. They can learn about the Strigoni and the prejudices that particular group experience in the old world. They have a kind of a person who speaks for them, a major NPC, Raiko, and the characters get to know him, and they hopefully are endeared to the Strigoni as a group of people, or at the very least, they're shown that the prejudices that their characters may have towards these group of wanderers is unjustified. They also learn that this particular area is haunted by a beast. It's a folkloric monster. There's not really any sense that it's real, and this is WFRP, so it's not like OSE, it's not like a D&D like game. If something is folkloric, it can be folkloric. It doesn't actually have to be like a real monster. They learn that there is this folkloric monster known as the Beast of Orchlam, which is said to haunt the Grausee, the nearby marshes, and has done for some time. It's kind of like a legend, a curse of the area. They also learn that near the campsite there is a set of kind of Ogham stones, standing stones made of a strange black material. and they're actually asked by the characters to rip them down and repair, get ready to kind of like use that space for something else. So that's one of their jobs on site, is to kind of remove these standing stones. And they can actually find a couple of things. If they persist, they can actually find that they mark a tomb, which is quite cool. They mark a tomb of an ancient race in Warhammer called the Fimir. And the presence of these stones is actually significant for understanding the kind of what's going on here, but it's not clear to the characters. And then as this is going on, it's clear that the tensions between Stiegler and Reuter are kind of rising. That they're not getting on, that actually she thinks he's basically useless, he doesn't have enough experience of business, and that this whole enterprise of building this mill is going to fall to pieces, and they're all going to end up out of pocket. And as I said before, it's also obvious that Thulgrim is not giving his all to building this mill, and actually he's directing the Strigony in ways that are not particularly productive, and it's not clear why he's doing that. So as it goes on, it's eventually discovered that Rutger Reuter has been killed. He's like, his body's massacred in his tent, in his kind of wagon, and a three-toed monster or a three-toed creature has left prints in the soft mud and is heading into the grouse, and everyone panics because they're like, especially the Strigony, they're of the opinion that the beast of the Orchlam has come and claimed someone here. What happens is this starts an argument between Thulgrim, who really isn't going to get paid, and Stiegler, who has one of the keys to the kind of money box. And I like that. That's kind of like very Frankfurt-esque. It's very kind of like late medieval, early Renaissance German. She's got one of the keys to the money chest. Very guildish, right? Very kind of like to do with guilds and kind of mercantile. She has one of the keys, and obviously Reuter would have had one of the keys as well. So that starts an argument between them. What happens is the characters, for whatever reason, they eventually decide they're going to track down the killers, the kind of the creature that killed Reuter, and they go into the grousey, and it starts an exploration of the grousey. And you have this wonderful description. It reminds me of the kind of the Dead Marshes in Lord of the Rings, where they're moving through these kind of like strange witch-lighted areas that's eerie with creeping fog. And what they find is actually there's three murderers, three cutthroats that have been hired by Stiegler to murder Reuter because he was inexperienced, and she was so kind of like anxious about this kind of business deal falling through. So as the party address and confront these three cutthroats, what happens deep in the marsh is they hear a shriek, and the beast of Orchlam appears. And it is a fantastic encounter because nobody's expecting it at that point. It subverts the established expectations of the module. And what it is an ancient, wizened, rheumatic kind of, very, very old, half-blind basilisk that slithers into view, and they end up in a really terrible fight. And usually the murderers get killed. They will attempt to turn on the characters if they survive this fight, but they're usually killed, and the characters have to do their best to either fight and kill or drive off this basilisk. And it's just like, oh god, like this is so enjoyable as a setup and a kind of final reveal. So they deal with the basilisk and the murderers, and they return to camp, and they pretend they're probably going to demand their pay at that point. And they may or may not be aware that Stiegler kind of set them up. They probably are going to be, but they might not be. What happens is they find that Stiegler and the dwarf Thulgrim have kind of had an argument, and they find out from Fraulein Stiegler that Thulgrim has stolen the money chest and has done a runner. They can chase after him, they can eventually track him down, and it turns out that basically Thulgrim, the reason that he wasn't putting his best into the work is that his family, his clan, had been embezzled, had been conned by Stiegler and the Jungfreuds of Ubersreich out of his clan fortune, and he was basically going to find a way to get that money back. We learned that his son took the Slayer Oath, which is a really big deal for dwarves in Warhammer. We find that his other two children only kind of are existing because they have called in kind of like ancient agreements with other dwarfs. It's really humiliating what's happened to Thulgrim. When I've run this, the players have always actually ended up being really sympathetic towards him. He agrees to give back as much money as he's got, although he doesn't accept that he's really done anything wrong, even if the means were dishonorable. He believes that he's returning stolen money to himself. And then he agrees to take the Slayer Oath as well. it's brilliant, this module. It just gets across. There's so much going on. So let's just talk about what I like, which is there's a lot going on here. So it's a really well balanced module with parts of exploration, mystery investigation, NPC interaction, combat, lots of kind of hinted narrative and exploration of history. There's so much going on, and a really interesting location of the construction site. It is one of the best balanced modules in terms of appealing to all the different tiers of play that I've ever read and ever run, and I'd recommend playing it for that. And that brings me to one point I want to address straight away. You don't need to run this with WFRP. You could run this using Old School Essentials, Dungeon Crawl Classic, my own system, Journeyman Expert Master. I probably will run it using Gem at some point, or any kind of like old school D&D system. It would work for any of those. You just have to convert the stats for the Basilisk and for the Murderers. It's a brilliant introduction to the late medieval, early Renaissance world of Warhammer. If you are wanting to set something in Warhammer's world, if you wanted to run a Warhammer campaign, I think that this is one of the best places to start. It conveys a lot of the setting in very little space. It actually does a better job of it, I think, than the also brilliant module Shadows over Bergenhafen, which I reviewed here. And you can use it with any old school system. It's going to work really, really well. Not in terms of compatibility with mechanics, but just in terms of the ideas that it's conveying. Now, the attack by the stir pike is brilliant. There's a couple of moments that are just fantastic in this module. It almost starts in Medea's Res. It doesn't quite start in the middle of things because it starts with them being introduced to Rutger Reuter. That start with the stir pike, that kind of almost mundane monster, the idea of just like a giant animal, is really engaging. It's really different. I said before, that characteristic underbite and the kind of cold, clear water and the torpedo shape of the giant pike is just fantastic. It's really good fun. Another thing that I really like about this is something that Shadows over Bergenhafen does well as well, and just Warhammer does well, really, generally. Maybe better than any other kind of setting or set of rules I've ever come across. The mixture of mundane, internecine human problems, right? These kind of like these two merchant houses that are not really getting on, and they're worried about their investment, right? That's kind of like really kind of like petty and petulant and real and human and irritating. And then it's mixed with this idea of there are real inimical forces in the world. There are real evil forces, real kind of malice towards the idea that people exist and that they're trying to exist in this kind of world. And that's what the Basilisk is, and that's what's going on. Really, really, really perfect kind of contrast and juxtaposition of those two things. The NPCs in this module are fantastic. Those, specifically Raiko, the Strigony guy. I think that the author does a really brilliant job of conveying the Strigony in a way that emphasizes the fact that the prejudice that this particular group of people feel is not justified. Raiko is a really endearing character who will help the player characters. Thulgrim is really interesting. He's got motivations. He's compelling as kind of like this dwarf engineer who is kind of dishonored. And then Reuter and Stiegler, those two. I mean, they're just like classic WFRP NPCs. I really like Thulgrim's secret plot, the fact that there is this side element going on that the players don't really need to interact with, but they can do. The fact that he's working against his employers to do this, that adds it adds depth as well as breadth to the module. There's quite a big breadth as well. There's lots of stuff going on, but it adds depth. The stuff that's going on is interesting. And then also, one thing that I really, really like is the truth about the Oghamstones, the Fimir and the Basilisk. So what's going on is the Fimir were an ancient race that once inhabited this place. You can find underneath their Oghamstones, as I mentioned earlier, you can find one of their tombs. Well, the Basilisk is one of their creatures that has existed for a very, very long time. And it was actually originally kind of created or spawned here to guard them, to guard their culture. And I love the Basilisk, this kind of like real folkloric monster. I always describe it as smelling like dead skin. It's kind of covered in weeping sores. It's half blind. It's stiff with rheumatism. I imagine it's kind of like 8 legs, kind of like, or 6 legs. I have many a Basilisk. It's got like moving kind of like jerkily with kind of like, stiff with rheumatism. Just fantastic characterization of a monster. Really compelling. So what did I change, and what concerns might a game master have when running this module? Right, let's just get the stuff, the kind of like the real indictment out of the way. The prose is dense. It's 21 pages. And you've got to read all of it. You can't kind of run this without knowing everything that's going on before. No, it's only 21 pages, so actually it is, that's quite enjoyable to read. It is enjoyable to read, but there's some things that are enjoyable to read that are not enjoyable to run. And the biggest thing for me is that there is no atmospherics given here. There's no box text like in the DCC module, or atmospherics as you would expect in something like an Old School Essentials module. You can see how they're done really brilliantly in my review for Winter's Daughter here. Instead, the wrong thing seems to be italicized. And what is italicized? What is given as box text? The conversations. This doesn't make sense to me. So everything that is italicized, nearly everything, is just things that people say. And there's like lists of questions that characters might answer, and then box text that you'd read out. No one is going to use that like that. I just don't think that's helpful. It would have been better off if you're going to have questions, which I'm not really sure that you need to do that. Just a list of the kind of things they might say in response, but not word for word. It's not helpful. It makes the kind of text more dense to run, even though it makes it actually more enjoyable to read. And I think that is one thing that I would change. You have to really pass the kind of conversations as a game master before you run it. That's the real thing that you need to get to grips with. The other thing is, if you are going to come from a more traditional fantasy game like OSE, like Journeyman Expert Master, like BX, like D&D or DCC, you do need to put a bit of legwork into it can be hard to evoke the danger and folklorism of the basilisk. If you're playing characters, or with a group of players even, that are used to kind of going from room to room in a dungeon and slaying basilisks by the dozen, well, this particular one may seem a bit of a hard sell in terms of why it's interesting. So just emphasizing that, I would emphasize the kind of ridiculousness of the presence of a basilisk if I were you. Where have you said it in your world? Say, well, this is right in the middle of settled areas. There's not a basilisk here. So that's one thing. And then the last thing that I would just be aware of, that I would want to convey, is that it's really hard for the characters to locate this Fimir tomb underneath the stones. It's really hard for them to connect the dots between the Fimir, the basilisk, and the standing stones, which are kind of leftovers from their culture. I would just I would make that really easy to find out. I've talked a bit before about Justin Alexander's from the Alexandrian blogs, the 3-clue rule. There is a bit of mystery going on here. You got to make that really, really clear, because otherwise it's pointless. Stuff that exists in text or in the game master's head doesn't exist in the world unless at least one of the players knows about it. And so make use of it because it's interesting and cool, and we like the idea of ancient kind of lost civilizations in our particular gaming niche. So that is If Looks Could Kill. It's a really, really, really good module. I'd really, really recommend picking it up. It's been out a few years now. As ever, thank you for taking the time to listen to me. Like and subscribe, do all that kind of useful stuff. I'll put a link to the module and maybe this book in the scroll box below. As ever, many thanks. I appreciate it, and we will speak again soon. Thank you.